The gavel struck the bench, its echo slicing through the courtroom like thunder rolling against stone walls. Elizabeth Moore gripped her trembling hands tighter, forcing control into her posture as eyes turned her way. Richard Kane adjusted his cufflinks, his calm mask unshaken, the faintest smirk brushing his lips as though he alone held the truth. Ethan Cole leaned forward, sharp-eyed and restless, muttering, "This isn't justice, it's theater." David Grant placed his hand gently on Elizabeth's shoulder, whispering, "They can't destroy what they don't understand." Sarah Miller stood near the bench, arms folded, her gaze heavy with silent calculation as she studied Richard. A phone vibrated sharply against polished wood, the sound grating pulling attention like a sudden spark. Richard's eyes narrowed, his smirk deepening into something sinister, while Elizabeth felt the weight of an unseen storm pressing closer. Its darkness inevitable. Elizabeth walked the courthouse corridor, heart hammering from the verdict's echo, still lingering. David kept close, voice calm as he said, "They want to see you collapse, but don't give them that satisfaction." Elizabeth forced a small nod, though the weight in her chest grew heavier. Ethan darted past, muttering, "It's bigger than you think, and it's only starting." Sarah followed behind, scanning every passerby, her shoulders tense as if anticipating an attack from shadows. The marble hall seemed endless, echoing their footsteps like judgment pressing down. Richard Kane emerged from the courtroom with measured strides, phone pressed to his ear, his tone low and commanding. His smirk was faint but sharp, his presence poisoning the air. Elizabeth inhaled slowly, realizing that the silence of the night ahead would be more dangerous than the courtroom they had just left. The courthouse steps were swallowed by night fog curling around street lamps like secrets that refused to fade. Elizabeth paused halfway down, whispering, "How much more will be taken before I shatter?" Ethan crouched near the railing, sketchbook balanced on his knees, muttering, "It's already broken. You just don't see it yet." David stayed close, his tone steady as he said, "Broken pieces can build stronger walls." Sarah lingered at the curb, her sharp eyes tracking every approaching car as unease carved into her stance. From across the street, Richard's silhouette lingered in shadow, phone pressed to his ear, his words muffled under the growl of an engine. Elizabeth's chest rose and fell quickly, her pulse matching the city's restless rhythm. The echo of the gavel replayed in her mind, each strike sharper than the last, like a curse refusing to die. Inside David's car, the hum of the engine felt louder than words. Elizabeth sat in the back, staring at her bag where a sealed letter lay hidden, its edges worn from years of being untouched. David's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, his voice low, "Strength is not enough unless you decide what to do with it." Ethan tapped impatiently against the glass, muttering, "Strength means nothing without truth." Sarah, seated in the passenger seat, whispered, "And truth has a cost none of us can predict." Elizabeth's hand brushed against the letter, its weight pulling at her like a chain. The city streaked past outside in neon blurs, indifferent to her struggle. On a flickering billboard, Richard's name appeared beside breaking headlines, his shadow stretching beyond the walls of the courtroom, wrapping itself around her thoughts. The car turned into a narrow alley, shadows swallowing the neon glow behind them. Elizabeth whispered, "Why here?" David answered quietly, "Because truth hides where no one looks." Ethan shoved his door open before the car stopped fully, snapping, "You can't outrun what's already chasing you." Sarah stepped out carefully, her voice tense, "We don't have long." The pavement glistened with rain, rust and damp mixing into the air. Elizabeth's chest tightened as her hand brushed against the sealed letter, its presence burning against her palm. At the far end of the alley, Richard's silhouette appeared briefly in headlights, his stance deliberate, his presence heavy. Elizabeth froze, the darkness pressing closer. The battle had not only followed her here, it was waiting for her, watching. Elizabeth sat in a dimly lit diner, her coffee untouched, steam curling upward like questions left unanswered. David slid into the booth across from her, his calm voice low as he said, "They will circle until you falter, but you must hold steady." She met his gaze briefly, but her eyes drifted toward the window, where reflections blurred with rain streaks. Ethan stormed in, tossing his backpack onto the seat, muttering, It's all connected, and none of you want to see it. Sarah entered a moment later, her gaze sweeping the room before she sat near the edge, her body tense with vigilance. Richard's face flashed across a muted television above the counter, his speech rehearsed, his charisma flawless, his lies polished to perfection. Elizabeth whispered, "How do you fight a man who controls every truth?" The silence that followed felt heavier than words. Elizabeth walked alone beneath the flickering streetlights outside the diner, her reflection fractured in puddles at her feet. Her voice wavered as she said softly, "Every step feels like I'm walking deeper into his shadow." Ethan appeared suddenly from the corner, sketchbook in hand, whispering, "You're not in his shadow, you're trapped in his design." She froze, startled by his sudden presence, her hand instinctively brushing her bag where the letter rested. David called from behind, "Don't listen to half-truths spoken in anger." Sarah stepped closer, her tone sharp. Anger is sometimes the only truth left standing. From the other end of the street, Richard's black car passed slowly, its tinted windows reflecting nothing but darkness. Elizabeth's chest tightened as the engine growled, its presence a reminder that danger always lingered, even in silence. Elizabeth sat on her apartment floor, surrounded by scattered documents, each page a fragment of something larger and more sinister. Her fingers trembled as she whispered, pieces that never seemed to fit, yet they always point to him. David crouched beside her, his steady voice reassuring, "We'll find the thread that binds them." Ethan leaned against the wall, sarcasm cutting through the tension as he muttered, "Threads don't bind, they strangle." Sarah stood near the window, blinds half drawn, her gaze sharp on the dark street below. The silence of the room was broken by a faint hum, the television flickering in the background with Richard's campaign ad, his voice smooth, promising justice while concealing lies. Elizabeth pressed her hand to the sealed letter in her lap, whispering, "I don't know if I have the strength to open this." The room felt suffocated by shadows closing in. The group gathered in a parking garage dimly lit by humming fluorescent lights, their breaths visible in the chill of the night. Elizabeth's voice cracked as she said, "We're being hunted in every direction, and I don't know where safe begins." Ethan kicked at the concrete floor, muttering, "Safe is a lie. You either fight or you fall." David placed a hand on the hood of the car, steady and calm, his tone firm. "We can't lose control to fear." Sarah scanned the shadows, her hand brushing the concealed weapon at her side, whispering, "Fear keeps us alive, but silence kills." The sound of footsteps echoed distantly, drawing all eyes to the far side of the garage. Richard's silhouette emerged briefly under a flickering light before vanishing into darkness. Elizabeth's pulse raced, knowing the battle was already inside their circle. Elizabeth stood on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline, wind whipping her hair, the glow of skyscrapers flickering like false promises. She whispered, "The higher I climb, the smaller I feel against him." Ethan perched on the edge, sketchbook resting on his knees, muttering, "He built this city to bury people like us." David stood with arms crossed, his voice steady, "Cities can be rebuilt, lies can't last forever." Sarah walked slowly across the rooftop, her eyes scanning for movement as she replied, "Lies last as long as people want them to." Across the skyline, a giant billboard illuminated Richard's face, his smile polished, his slogan promising hope. Elizabeth's grip tightened around the sealed letter in her pocket, her whisper lost in the wind. "Maybe the truth will destroy more than his lies ever could." The city hummed below, indifferent to their fight. Elizabeth sat in the records room, dim light flickering as she sifted through boxes of files marked confidential. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Every page bleeds with corruption, but none bear his name." Ethan leaned over her shoulder, muttering, "He doesn't leave his fingerprints, only scars." David stood by the door, watchful, his voice steady, "Scars are enough if we can trace the wound." Sarah crouched near the shelves, pulling out a hidden folder, whispering, "Not all wounds heal clean. Some rot until they spread." Richard's name echoed from the documents, not directly but hidden in coded transactions. Elizabeth's breath hitched, the letter in her bag pressing against her like a reminder. She whispered, "The truth is here. but it's buried alive. The shadows seemed to close in, as if listening. Elizabeth spread the documents across a motel bed, her hands shaking as the patterns began to connect. "It's a maze," she muttered, "and every path leads back to him." Ethan perched at the foot of the bed, sketching lines between names, snapping, "It's not a maze, it's a trap." David sat in the corner chair, his calm tone unwavering. "Traps can be escaped if you see them for what they are." Sarah leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her gaze heavy as she said, "Not all escapes are without cost." The television hummed softly with background noise, showing Richard addressing a crowd with rehearsed ease, his words dripping false hope. Elizabeth pressed her palm to her forehead, whispering, "How do you expose a man who built his lies into the system itself?" Elizabeth walked through the crowded city square, clutching her bag close as voices and neon lights swirled around her. Ethan darted ahead, calling back, "You're too careful, that's why he wins." David followed at her side, calm yet firm, saying, "Caution is survival, and survival keeps us fighting." Sarah scanned the faces in the crowd, whispering, "Enemies hide best among the ordinary." A digital screen towered above them, Richard's image filling the display, his smile flawless as slogans echoed from speakers. Elizabeth stopped, staring up, her voice trembling. "He owns the air, the streets, the voices. How can truth break through this noise?" The crowd cheered blindly, unaware of the rot beneath the mask. Ethan scribbled frantically in his sketchbook, muttering, "Masks crack. They always crack." Elizabeth sat in a darkened library, pages spread across a heavy oak table, her hands trembling as she whispered, "These archives are missing pieces. Someone erased them." Ethan leaned against a pillar, defiant. "He erases people, not just papers." David leaned forward, voice calm but grave. "If something was erased, it left a trace. We must find it." Sarah moved silently along the shelves, flashlight beam cutting through dust as she said, "Traces are fragile. Too much light can destroy them." Elizabeth's eyes fixed on a margin note scribbled in fading ink, initials that connected Richard to a hidden fund. Her breath caught, the silence of the library pressing heavier than any courtroom. She whispered, "This is the crack in his mask." On a deserted train platform, Elizabeth stood clutching the folder tight, the rumble of distant tracks echoing like a warning. David stayed close, his calm voice steady. "This is enough to shake him, but it must be used wisely." Ethan paced near the edge, snapping, "Wisdom is weakness when time runs out." Sarah positioned herself near the stairwell, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows as she muttered, "Every step forward makes us more visible." Across the tracks, Richard appeared briefly, his silhouette framed under harsh fluorescent lights, his presence suffocating even from afar. Elizabeth's voice cracked, "He knows. He always knows." The approaching train roared louder, drowning her words as the folder trembled in her hands like a loaded weapon. Elizabeth spread the hidden folder across the motel table, her hands trembling as her eyes caught the initials scrawled in fading ink. "This ties him to the fund," she whispered, her voice cracking. David leaned closer, his calm tone steady. "This isn't just evidence, it's a confession buried in paper." Ethan snapped his pencil in half, muttering, "Confessions don't matter when power rewrites history." Sarah shifted uneasily, whispering, "History bends to silence, but silence always breaks." Elizabeth pressed her palm against the letter in her bag, as if drawing strength from it. The television flickered again with Richard's face, smiling before a cheering crowd. Elizabeth whispered, "He built his empire on shadows, and the cracks are showing." The room seemed to breathe with the weight of betrayal. Elizabeth confronted David in the dim light of the motel bathroom, steam curling from a leaking pipe. "You knew," she said, her voice sharp with betrayal. David met her gaze in the mirror, his expression calm but haunted. "I made a choice once for the greater good." Ethan slammed his fist against the doorframe, muttering, "Greater good always means someone gets buried." Sarah stood at the doorway, whispering, "You kept this from us from her." Elizabeth's eyes burned with tears, her voice breaking. "You were my anchor. How could you be part of this?" David's silence weighed heavier than any denial. The truth settled in like a shadow that could not be undone. Elizabeth sat on the motel bed, staring at David with hollow eyes. "Were you ever on my side?" she asked softly. David answered, voice low, "I was always on your side, even when it meant betraying you." Ethan shook his head, muttering, "That's not loyalty, that's poison." Sarah crossed her arms tightly, whispering, "Poison spreads fastest from the ones closest to us." Elizabeth clutched the sealed letter, her voice trembling. "Everything I thought I had is breaking." David's face carried regret, but no retreat. Richard's shadow lingered between them, invisible yet present, tightening its grip without a word spoken. Elizabeth walked through the underground tunnel, her footsteps echoing against damp stone walls. Ethan rushed ahead with his sketchbook, muttering, "Secrets live down here." Sarah followed closely, scanning every dark corner. David trailed behind, his silence louder than words. At the tunnel's end, Elizabeth found a rusted box hidden under bricks, her breath catching as she pulled it open. Inside were photographs, proof of Richard with men tied to the fund. "This is the truth," she whispered, her hands shaking. David's voice was low. "Truth will burn everything, including you." Sarah said sharply, "Better burned than buried." Ethan smirked faintly. "Buried things always crawl back anyway." The air thickened with the weight of revelation. On the rooftop of a deserted building, Elizabeth held the photographs against the city lights, her voice shaking. "This will ruin him." David stood beside her, his calm voice heavy. "It will ruin us too." Ethan muttered, "Good, let it all burn." Sarah said firmly, "We can't run anymore. This is the moment." Across the skyline, Richard's billboard glowed, his smile cutting through the night like a blade. Elizabeth whispered, "This is the crack. But if I push, everything collapses." The wind whipped the photographs, threatening to carry them away. For the first time, Richard's empire no longer felt untouchable. It felt fragile. The city hummed below, unaware that its foundations were shaking. Elizabeth stood in the courthouse lobby, folder clutched tight against her chest, her whisper sharp. "If I walk through those doors, there's no return." David's voice was steady, calm but heavy. Return was never an option the moment you uncovered him. Ethan's eyes blazed, muttering, "Burn it all. That's the only way to win." Sarah glanced around, tension etched in her voice. "Every eye in this building is watching us. He already knows we're here." Across the marble floor, Richard appeared, flanked by aides, his polished stride exuding control. Elizabeth felt her knees weaken as the weight of justice pressed down like chains. "This is the moment," she whispered, trembling. The walls seemed to close in, their shadows heavy with secrets. Inside the courtroom, Elizabeth placed the folder on the table, her voice low, but unyielding. "The truth doesn't hide forever." Richard leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a calculated smirk. "Truth is a story," he said, "and I'm the one who writes it." Ethan slammed his hand on the bench, muttering, "Then let's tear out your pen." David raised his voice firmly. "This evidence will stand, no matter how deep your lies run." Sarah's gaze swept across the gallery, her sharp tone a warning. "He'll twist this moment, but twisting can't stop breaking." Elizabeth's heart raced as the gavel slammed, silence cutting through the room. The folder's contents glared under the light, undeniable and heavy, like a weapon waiting to strike. Elizabeth's voice rang across the courtroom, shaking but resolute. "This is proof that the empire you built is nothing but fraud." Richard leaned forward, eyes narrowing, his tone cold, "Careful, or you'll bury yourself in the rubble you've made." Ethan whispered fiercely, "He's already buried in lies." David's calm voice cut through the tension. "The truth is enough to collapse even your walls." Sarah's whisper was sharp. "The walls are cracking, but they won't fall quietly." Gasps rippled through the room as the photographs and records spread across the bench. Elizabeth's pulse thundered, her hand tightening on the letter hidden in her bag. The weight of years pressed down, but the first strike had finally landed. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she held the sealed letter, whispering, "This holds more than evidence. It holds the truth of what I've lived with." David's eyes softened briefly, his tone low. Some truths destroy more than lies ever could. Ethan's voice cracked. Then let them destroy. We've lived in rubble long enough. Sarah stepped closer, firm and unyielding. If you open it now, there's no going back. Richard's eyes gleamed with menace as he murmured, "Read it, and you burn with me." Elizabeth's fingers tore at the seal, the sound sharp as glass breaking. The weight of silence pressed into the room, heavier than any verdict ever spoken. Elizabeth's voice cracked as she read aloud. This letter exposes the pact made in shadows, the price paid in silence, the names written in blood. The courtroom gasped, murmurs erupting like wildfire. Richard rose to his feet, shouting, "Lies! Every word is forged." Ethan shouted back, "No, this is your grave." David's calm broke into anger, his voice firm. "You can't escape what you built with stolen lives." Sarah's whisper cut sharp as steel. "Justice doesn't whisper anymore, it roars." The gavel slammed, the sound echoing like thunder. Elizabeth's tears blurred the words, but her voice carried strength as she declared, "The mask has fallen, and the world will see you." Elizabeth left the courthouse, the roar of reporters pressing like thunder against her ears. Flashes blinded her vision as microphones lunged forward. She whispered, "They don't want justice, they want spectacle." David kept her close, his calm voice steady. "Walk through it. Don't give them more than silence." Ethan shoved past cameras, shouting, "They'll twist this before the ink dries." Sarah glared at the crowd, her tone sharp. "Truth doesn't need their approval. It already stands." Elizabeth tightened her grip on the folder, each step heavier, as if the pavement itself judged her. Richard's face lit up screens above the crowd, defiant even in defeat. Elizabeth murmured, "Even falling, he still controls the stage." The chaos clung to her like smoke. Elizabeth sat alone in her apartment, documents scattered, the letter torn open on the table. Her whisper trembled. "It's done, but nothing feels finished." David stood by the window, quiet, before saying, "Justice never feels clean. It leaves scars." Ethan paced the room, snapping, "Scars don't matter when rot still spreads." Sarah sat near the door, voice low, "Rot can't be erased. It can only be exposed." Elizabeth touched the torn envelope, tears slipping down her cheeks. "This truth doesn't feel like freedom," she whispered. The hum of the city outside was indifferent, its neon glow seeping through blinds. In the distance, Richard's voice echoed faintly from a broadcast, "Still fighting, still unbroken." The silence in the room carried heavier weight than his words. Elizabeth stood by the riverside at dusk, wind tugging at her hair as she whispered, "The truth is out, but it feels like ashes." David placed a hand on the railing, steady, saying, "Ashes feed what grows next." Ethan skipped a stone into the water, muttering, "Nothing grows when the soil is poisoned." Sarah scanned the empty path behind them, her voice low. "Poison lingers, but it doesn't last forever." Elizabeth pulled the photographs from her pocket, staring at them one last time before whispering, "These were supposed to set me free." The water shimmered under fading light, swallowing her reflection. She held the papers tighter, uncertain whether to keep or release them. The weight of choice pressed harder than judgment ever had. Elizabeth entered a quiet chapel, its candles flickering against worn stone walls. She whispered, "I don't know if this was justice or vengeance." David sat in the back pew, his calm tone low. "Sometimes they're the same." Ethan knelt near the altar, sketchbook resting beside him, muttering, "No altar cleanses what's broken." Sarah stood by the door, her voice sharp. "The world outside hasn't changed, only unmasked." Elizabeth lit a candle, her trembling hand steadying as flame rose. "Then let this burn for what was lost," she said. The air smelled of wax and dust, silence heavy like prayer. Richard's name echoed even here, carried by whispers of those who doubted or defended him. Elizabeth bowed her head, carrying both truth and burden. Elizabeth returned to the alley where it began, rain dripping from broken pipes, pavement slick beneath her shoes. She whispered, "We exposed him, but the shadows remain. David's voice was calm but weary. The system doesn't fall with one man. Ethan scowled, muttering, "Then we've won nothing." Sarah replied sharply, "We've won truth, and truth spreads like fire." Across the alley, Richard's silhouette appeared one last time in a flicker of headlights, his figure diminished but unbroken. Elizabeth gripped the letter close, whispering, "He's weaker, but not gone." The rain fell harder, drowning her words in a steady rhythm. The battle felt finished, but the war remained in silence. Elizabeth sat on her apartment balcony, dawn breaking with pale light streaking the skyline. Her whisper trembled, "The truth is out, but I still feel trapped in his shadow." David placed a cup of coffee beside her, his calm voice quiet. Shadows fade when the light grows stronger. Ethan leaned against the railing, muttering, "Light fades too, faster than anyone admits." Sarah stood near the sliding door. Arms crossed, her tones sharp. "What matters is the fire left behind." Elizabeth stared at the torn letter on the table, the words etched into her memory. The city stirred awake beneath them, indifferent, humming with routine. Elizabeth exhaled, realizing victory didn't erase scars, it only revealed how deep they ran. Elizabeth walked through a quiet park. Autumn leaves scattered across the path, the crisp air heavy with silence. She whispered, "Peace feels foreign, like it doesn't belong to me." David walked at her side, steady as ever, saying, "Peace is earned, not given." Ethan kicked at the leaves, muttering, "Earned peace is still fragile." Sarah trailed slightly behind, voice firm, "Fragile things can still endure." A child's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder of innocence untouched by corruption. Elizabeth stopped, closing her eyes, gripping her bag tightly. She murmured, "The cost of truth is heavier than the lies I exposed." The wind carried her words away, scattering them with the leaves. Elizabeth entered the empty newsroom, headlines about Richard plastered across muted screens. She whispered, "His name still owns the front page, even in disgrace." David scanned the monitors, voice even, names fade, deeds linger. Ethan sprawled across a desk, muttering, "Deeds don't linger, they rot." Sarah paced the edge of the room, sharp eyes on the flashing tickers, whispering, "Rot spreads faster than truth." Elizabeth dropped the photographs onto a desk, staring at them one final time. "I thought this would free me," she said, "but it feels like a chain." The screens flickered with Richard's defiant image, refusing to vanish. The silence in the newsroom pressed heavy, heavier than any headline. Elizabeth stood at the grave of the lingering memory, her hand brushing the cold stone. She whispered, "I thought truth would honor you, but it only deepened the silence." David stood beside her, soft voice steady, "They live on in what you carried forward." Ethan crouched near the flowers, muttering, "Dead don't care about justice. Only the living bleed for it." Sarah placed her hand gently on Elizabeth's shoulder, whispering, "Some ghosts guide, others haunt, but they never truly leave." Elizabeth's tears fell onto the stone, her voice shaking, "I wanted to bring light, but I only uncovered more shadows." The wind stirred, carrying with it the faintest sound of a memory humming through the air. Elizabeth stood alone in her apartment, city lights glowing through the window. She whispered, "Justice was never the end. It was the beginning of another lie waiting." David's voice echoed faintly in her memory, "Shadows only exist because of light." Ethan's words lingered too, sharp and restless, "Let it all burn." Sarah's whisper returned like an anchor, "Truth always costs more than we think." Elizabeth opened her hand, the torn letter resting against her palm, its edges frayed but its words permanent. She whispered, "The agenda was never his alone. It was the system's, and it still breathes." Outside, sirens wailed faintly, the city restless as ever. The silence that followed left one chilling truth. Justice had not ended the story. It had only unmasked it.